Professor Aletha Meridian adjusted her glasses and surveyed the lecture hall filled with graduate students. "Today's assignment is deceptively simple," she announced, her voice echoing through the hushed room. "Analyze the emotional dynamics of a family dispute where parents disagree about their child's career choice, and propose a resolution strategy that preserves family harmony while respecting individual autonomy." A collective groan rose from the students. Most were rubbing their temples, already mentally drafting complex frameworks involving communication models, attachment theories, and cultural considerations. Only one student in the back row remained perfectly still, a being with crystalline skin that shifted through subtle color gradients as he processed information. Zorblax of Vryll sat motionless, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the overhead lights in geometric patterns. To his species, emotions were simply data points to be analyzed, not experiences to be felt. On Vryll, emotional intelligence had been perfected into a precise science called emotional calculus, something humans had only begun to grasp in their primitive psychology departments. As the student scribbled furiously, Zorblax simply closed his eyes for precisely 17 seconds. When he opened them, he tapped his datapad once, sending his completed assignment to the professor's terminal. Professor Meridian blinked when the notification appeared. "Mr. Zorblax, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but the assignment is due at the end of class." "With all due respect, Professor," Zorblax replied in perfectly modulated English, his voice devoid of inflection, but somehow managing to convey polite deference. "The solution was computationally trivial. I have submitted my analysis." The classroom fell silent. Several students exchanged skeptical glances. Liana Young, a doctoral candidate who had spent 3 years studying family systems theory, scoffed audibly. "Computationally trivial? Emotional dynamics aren't equations you can solve in seconds." Zorblax's crystalline skin shifted to a pale blue hue, the Vryllian equivalent of mild confusion. "But they are equations. Allow me to demonstrate." Without waiting for permission, he rose and approached the holographic display at the front of the room. His 3-fingered hand made precise gestures, summoning complex mathematical models that floated in the air. "Consider the parent-child dynamic as a system of emotional vectors," Zorblax began, his explanation as clear as it was alien. "Each family member generates emotional output measured in effective units. Parent expresses 78.30 of concern regarding career stability, while parent B expresses 64.2 of concern about social status. The child generates 92.10 of passion for their chosen path, but also 45.70 of anxiety about parental disapproval." The students stared, dumbfounded, as Zorblax manipulated the holographic equations with mathematical precision. "By applying Vryllian emotional calculus," he continued, "we can determine the optimal resolution path by minimizing emotional dissonance while maximizing individual fulfillment. The solution involves parent A reducing their concern output by 32.1%, parent B by 27.8%, and the child increasing their communication frequency by 4.3 times weekly. This creates an emotional equilibrium with 98.7% predicted stability." Professor Meridian's eyes widened as she ran the numbers through her own terminal. "My God, he's right. The model checks out perfectly." Liana Young stood up, her face flushed. "But that's not how emotions work. You can't just reduce human feelings to numbers and percentages. There are nuances, histories, cultural contexts." "Precisely," Zorblax interrupted, his crystalline skin shifting to a warm amber, Vryllian for understanding. "Which is why my model incorporates 347 contextual variables, including cultural background coefficients, generational trauma indices, and socioeconomic stability factors. Would you like to see the full parameter matrix?" The room erupted into chaos. Students were frantically taking notes, arguing with each other, and questioning everything they thought they knew about emotional intelligence. Professor Meridian struggled to restore order. "Silence, please," she finally commanded. "Mr. Zorblax, Would you mind explaining how your species developed this emotional calculus? Zorblax's skin cycled through several colors as he considered the question. On Vryll, emotions were once our greatest weakness. Our early history was marked by constant conflict because we lacked the ability to process emotional data efficiently. 3 centuries ago, the great harmonization occurred when our scientists realized emotions follow predictable mathematical patterns. He gestured to the hologram, which now displayed a timeline of Vryllian history. We discovered that emotional states can be quantified, relationships between emotional variables can be modeled, and optimal resolution paths can be calculated with 99.4% accuracy. Emotional calculus became the foundation of Vryllian society. But don't you feel emotions? Asked Ben Carter, a clinical psychology student who had been unusually quiet. I mean, don't you actually experience them? Zorblax tilted his head, a gesture he had learned from observing humans. Experience is an imprecise term. We register emotional data and respond with appropriate behavioral outputs. On Vryll, we consider it inefficient to subject ourselves to the full intensity of emotional states, when we can achieve the same functional outcomes through calculated responses. Liana shook her head. That's horrifying. You're saying you don't actually feel anything. You just go through the motions based on calculations? Not at all, Zorblax corrected. We experience the optimal level of emotional resonance required for the situation. Why subject oneself to unnecessary distress when the same outcome can be achieved with minimal emotional expenditure? Consider grief. Our models indicate that 37.2% of the typical human grief response is counterproductive. On Vryll, we limit grief expression to the precise amount that facilitates healing without impairing functionality. Professor Meridian leaned forward, fascinated. So you're saying humans experience more emotion than is functionally necessary? Precisely, Zorblax confirmed. Your species suffers from what we call emotional inflation, experiencing emotions at intensities far beyond what is required for optimal functioning. It's analogous to spending 100 units of energy to accomplish a task that requires only 10. Ben spoke up again, his voice thoughtful. But isn't there value in the emotional experience itself? The depth, the richness of feeling things fully? Zorblax's skin cycled through several colors as he processed this. This is precisely why I came to Earth. My species excels at emotional problem-solving but lacks, what is the human term? Soul. We have mastered the mechanics of emotion, but not the experience. I'm here to study human emotional messiness to determine if there is value in what we would consider inefficiency. The classroom fell silent as students processed this revelation. Here was an alien who had mastered emotional intelligence in a way humans could only dream of, yet he had come to Earth to learn how to feel more. Professor Meridian cleared her throat. Mr. Zorblax, would you be willing to demonstrate your emotional calculus with a real-time example? Of course, Zorblax replied, his skin shifting to a neutral gray, the Vryllian equivalent of readiness. The professor turned to Liana. Liana, you've mentioned in office hours that you've been struggling with your relationship with your father regarding your career path. Would you be comfortable sharing the basics? Liana hesitated, then nodded. My father wanted me to become a doctor like him. I chose psychology instead. We haven't spoken in 6 months. Zorblax closed his multifaceted eyes for precisely 12 seconds. When he opened them, he began manipulating the holographic display. Father's emotional output, 87.40 of disappointment, 63.20 of concern for financial stability, 42.10 of wounded pride. Liana's output, 76.80 of determination, 54.30 of guilt, 38.90 of resentment. Current emotional distance, 7.2 emotional light years. The students gasped. How could he quantify something so personal with such precision? The optimal resolution path, Zorblax continued, involves Liana initiating contact with precisely 23.7% vulnerability, acknowledging her father's concerns while asserting her autonomy. The father should reduce his disappointment expression by 41.3% and increase expressions of support by 28.4%. This creates a 92.6% probability of reconciliation within 4.3 weeks. Liana stared at the hologram, tears welling in her eyes. That's exactly what I need to do. But how can you know this? Because emotional patterns are universal, Zorblax explained. Human emotions follow the same mathematical principles as Vryllian emotions, though your expressions are less efficient. The variables change, but the underlying calculus remains constant. Professor Meridian stood up, visibly excited. This is revolutionary. Mr. Zorblax, would you consider teaching a seminar on Vryllian emotional calculus? Zorblax's skin shifted through several rapid color changes, a sign of deep contemplation. I would be honored, Professor. However, I must be clear. My methods may challenge everything your students believe about emotional intelligence. That's precisely why we need this, Professor Meridian insisted. For centuries, psychology has treated emotions as something to be managed through intuition and experience. What if there's a more precise way? As the class ended, students crowded around Zorblax with questions. Liana approached him hesitantly. "Thank you," she said. "I think I'm going to call my father tonight." Zorblax tilted his head. "According to my calculations, the optimal time is 7:43 p.m. local time, when his stress hormones are at their lowest point. The probability of success increases by 18.3% if you mention his recent golf tournament victory first." Liana laughed, a genuine, emotional sound that made Zorblax's crystalline skin flicker with unexpected colors. "You know what? I think I'll just call him now and speak from my heart. Maybe there's something to be said for emotional inefficiency." Zorblax watched her walk away, processing this new information. Perhaps humans had something to teach his species after all. 2 weeks later, Zorblax stood before a packed lecture hall for his first seminar on Vryllian emotional calculus. To his surprise, not only psychology students had come, students from business, medicine, even the art department filled the seats. "Welcome," Zorblax began, his crystalline skin glowing a steady blue. "Today we explore the fundamental theorem of emotional calculus. All emotional states can be represented as vectors in multidimensional affective space." He summoned a complex hologram showing intersecting emotional vectors. "Consider romantic attraction. Human literature describes it as magic or chemistry, but in reality, it's a precise calculation of compatibility coefficients across 147 variables, including emotional resonance, communication patterns, and future projection alignment." A student from the art department raised her hand. "But doesn't reducing love to numbers kill the romance?" "On Vryll, we find it enhances romance," Zorblax replied. "When we understand the precise emotional needs of our partners, we can fulfill them with 94.7% greater accuracy. Romance isn't diminished by understanding, it's optimized." He demonstrated with a case study of a Vryllian couple whose relationship had been failing. By adjusting just 3 key emotional variables, frequency of positive reinforcement, timing of vulnerability sharing, and balance of shared activities, their relationship satisfaction increased by 63.2%. "But what about the unexpected?" asked Ben, who had become something of Zorblax's human liaison. "What about those magical moments that just happen, that you can't plan for?" Zorblax's skin shifted to a thoughtful purple. The serendipity coefficient. On Vryll, we deliberately introduce controlled uncertainty into relationships. Our models show that relationships benefit from precisely 17.3% unpredictability. Too little, and the relationship becomes stale. Too much, and it becomes unstable. The students exchanged glances. This alien was describing concepts they had only vaguely understood as chemistry, or spark with mathematical precision. Zorblax continued. "Now, Let's address workplace conflict, the human approach versus the Vryllian approach. He showed two scenarios. In the human approach, co-workers argued, emotions ran high, and eventually someone won while the other felt resentful. In the Vryllian approach, emotional outputs were measured in real time, optimal resolution paths calculated instantly, and conflicts resolved with minimal emotional expenditure. But doesn't that feel cold? Asked Liana, who had reconciled with her father using Zorblax's advice, but had noticed something missing. My father and I talk now, but it feels like we're following a script. Where's the genuine connection? Zorblax paused, his crystalline skin flickering through colors at an unusual rate. This is the paradox I came to Earth to understand. On Vryll, we achieve optimal emotional outcomes, but we lack what you call authenticity. We are beginning to suspect that emotional inefficiency, the extra 37.2% of grief, the unplanned romantic moments, the messy arguments that lead to deeper understanding, may serve a purpose we haven't quantified. The classroom fell silent as students processed this admission from their seemingly infallible teacher. Professor Meridian, who had been observing from the back, stepped forward. Zorblax, what if the answer isn't choosing between emotional precision and emotional messiness, but finding a balance? Zorblax's skin shifted to a color none of the humans had seen before, a shimmering blend of blue and gold. This is what I hoped to discover. Perhaps humans can learn efficiency from us, while we can learn depth from you. Emotional intelligence isn't about eliminating messiness. It's about understanding when precision serves us and when messiness does. He summoned a new hologram showing two intersecting curves. The optimal emotional intelligence exists at the intersection of calculated response and authentic experience. Too much calculation, and we lose humanity. Too much messiness, and we suffer needlessly. Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. Psychology students began incorporating emotional calculus into their therapeutic approaches, while Zorblax started experimenting with intentional emotional inefficiency. He would sometimes allow himself to feel emotions at suboptimal intensities, just to experience them more fully. One afternoon, Liana found Zorblax sitting alone in the campus garden, watching students laugh and interact. Learning to be inefficient, she asked with a smile. Zorblax's skin glowed a soft amber. I am practicing what you call small talk. On Vryll, we exchange only necessary information. Here, I am attempting to engage in conversation about the weather, which has no practical purpose but seems to create social connection. Liana laughed. How's it going? Terribly, Zorblax admitted. I calculated the optimal weather comment based on atmospheric data, but the human response was confusion followed by rapid departure. I believe I over-optimized. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Liana spoke again. You know, my father and I are getting along better than ever, but sometimes I miss the tension, the drama of our fights. It sounds crazy, but the easy peace feels shallow. Zorblax considered this. On Vryll, we have discovered that relationships require periodic emotional stress tests to maintain resilience. Perhaps the absence of conflict has reduced your relationship's emotional fitness. Liana nodded slowly. So what you're saying is, we need to fight sometimes. Precisely, Zorblax confirmed. But strategically, my calculations suggest introducing low-stakes disagreements at 14 three-day intervals to maintain relationship resilience without causing damage. Would you like the optimal topics and timing? Liana grinned. You know what? Let's just wing it. Maybe the math isn't always right. Zorblax's skin flickered with what might have been the Vryllian equivalent of a smile. The turning point came during a campus-wide crisis. A student had posted threatening messages online, and the university was in turmoil. Counseling centers were overwhelmed, students were scared, and administrators didn't know how to respond. Professor Meridian called an emergency meeting with Zorblax. We need your emotional calculus. How do we address this crisis with minimal emotional damage? Zorblax analyzed the situation for precisely 3 minutes. Standard Vryllian protocol would be to isolate the emotional vectors, calculate optimal intervention points, and deploy precisely calibrated responses. However, he paused, his crystalline skin shifting through colors at an unprecedented rate. This situation requires something different. Your campus isn't a system of emotional vectors. It's a community, and communities require more than optimal solutions. What do you mean? Professor Meridian asked. On Vryll, we would respond with perfect efficiency. But here, I've learned that sometimes the most inefficient responses create the strongest healing. Sometimes people need to feel more fear than necessary, to process grief more deeply, to connect in ways that don't follow mathematical patterns. He looked out the window at the anxious students gathering in the quad. The optimal solution isn't to minimize emotional pain, it's to transform it into connection. Humans do this through shared vulnerability, through gathering together despite fear. This is what I've come to call emotional alchemy. Professor Meridian nodded slowly. So what do we do? Zorblax's skin glowed a steady, warm gold. We gather everyone in the main quad. We acknowledge the fear without minimizing it. We create space for stories, for tears, for hugs that serve no calculable purpose. We allow the emotional messiness to happen, knowing it will lead to something stronger. The professor smiled. You've come a long way from seeing emotions as mere data points. Zorblax tilted his head. I've learned that some equations can't be solved. They must be lived. That evening, thousands of students gathered in the quad as university leaders acknowledged their fear and uncertainty. There were no perfect solutions offered, no attempts to minimize the emotional impact. Instead, there was shared vulnerability, spontaneous singing, and countless moments of human connection that followed no mathematical pattern. Zorblax watched from the sidelines, his crystalline skin reflecting the candlelight of the vigil. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of collective fear and hope, not as data points to be analyzed, but as experiences to be shared. As the vigil ended, Ben approached him. You were right. Sometimes the math isn't enough. Zorblax nodded. And sometimes the messiness is the point. I've calculated that my time on Earth has increased my emotional intelligence quotient by 387.2%. But more importantly, I've learned to value the unquantifiable. By the end of the semester, something extraordinary had happened. The university had established a new center for cross-species emotional intelligence, with Zorblax as its inaugural director. Psychology students were learning emotional calculus alongside traditional therapeutic approaches, while Vryllian researchers were studying the benefits of emotional inefficiency. At the graduation ceremony for Zorblax's seminar, Professor Meridian presented him with an honorary degree. Today we honor Zorblax of Vryll, who came to teach us precision and stayed to teach us heart. He showed us that emotional intelligence isn't about eliminating messiness. It's about understanding when to be precise and when to be messy. As Zorblax accepted the degree, his crystalline skin glowed with a spectrum of colors never before seen on campus. I came to Earth believing emotions could be solved like equations. I leave understanding that some equations aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be lived. Thank you for teaching me the value of emotional inefficiency. After the ceremony, Liana found Zorblax packing his things. You're really leaving? My exchange program ends tomorrow, Zorblax confirmed. But I've arranged for regular visits, and Vryll has invited several of your professors to visit us and study human emotional expression. Liana hugged him impulsively, a gesture that would have confused Zorblax months earlier. Now, he returned the embrace with precisely the right amount of pressure and duration. Will you miss us? She asked. Zorblax considered the question carefully. On Vryll, we measure attachment in emotional resonance units. By that metric, I will miss you all by precisely 78.3 Aru. But I've learned that numbers don't capture the full truth. So let me say it simply, yes, I will miss you. As Zorblax prepared to leave Earth, he stood one last time in the campus garden. He no longer tried to calculate the optimal way to appreciate the sunset or the perfect emotional response to saying goodbye. Instead, he simply felt the moment, the warmth of the sun, the sound of students laughing, the bittersweet ache of departure. For the first time, he understood why humans valued emotional inefficiency. Some experiences weren't meant to be optimized. They were meant to be felt. As his transport ship ascended, Zorblax looked down at the planet that had taught him more than all his years of study on Vryll. He had come to teach emotional calculus, but had learned something far more valuable. That the most important equations in life aren't solved with precision, but with heart. Back on Earth, the Center for Cross-Species Emotional Intelligence flourished. Students learned that emotional intelligence wasn't about eliminating messiness, but navigating it with awareness. They discovered that sometimes the most inefficient emotional responses created the strongest connections. And somewhere in the cosmos, a crystalline being continued his journey, not as a master of emotional calculation, but as a student of the human heart. He had come to solve emotional equations but had discovered that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to be lived, felt, and shared. The universe, Zorblax realized, wasn't governed solely by precise calculations. It was also shaped by the messy, beautiful, ineffable power of genuine connection. A truth no equation could fully capture, but one that made all the calculations worthwhile.